if you don't trust that that organization is actually doing what it says it's doing or is even present on the ground, then first and foremost, you're not getting the humanitarian response that you need in a crisis.
The lead editor and author of the 2026 World Disasters Report, put out by the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, is with us today. Charlotte Lindsey joins us from Geneva, Switzerland. Great to have you, Charlotte.
Thank you for having me.
So how has the humanitarian sector view of information really changed over the past few decades?
Quite substantially. In fact, the humanitarian sector probably 20 years ago really viewed information as something that needed to be passed to communities and actually was the subject of bottlenecks and absence of information getting to communities. And in fact, the World Disasters Report in 2005 really focused on that. Post the Indian Ocean tsunami was really looking at why did information not reach communities, what were the bottlenecks, and really saying, well, information needs to be aid. It's critical to response. 10 years later, the World Disasters Report looked at technology and said, wow, this is a huge enabler for humanitarian action and response, because we can actually now engage with communities that are impacted by humanitarian crises because they can use tools to reach us. Now, in 2026, the World Disasters Report is looking at truth, trust, and humanitarian action in the age of harmful information and saying now it's very, very difficult for humanitarian action to actually be carried out without being impacted by misinformation and disinformation, much of it often systematic and part of a campaign against humanitarian organizations in a way to undermine their trust and credibility in their response. And this is a huge change over the last decades.
Yeah, it's directly impeding the work of people on the ground. Your report talks about harmful information being a humanitarian crisis. How do you define harmful information?
So what we tried to do in the report, because there are so many different definitions and terms used, misinformation, disinformation, hate speech. So we tried to use a definition that really focused on the notion of harm. So harmful information, so that we can really recognize that information can create a harm and can be the real problem, rather than trying to define what the different types of information are, because that can evolve dependent on the situation around.
You also use the word infodemic, which I caught, and COVID was a prime example of false information colliding with a pandemic at the same time. What has been the lasting effect, do you think, of an infodemic on the humanitarian sector?
Yeah, so WHO really used the term infodemic around the pandemic. I think some of the lasting impacts of that are often this notion of undermining trust in institutions. And I think this notion that information can be as problematic and can spread in the same way that a virus or other illness can spread. And so I think this notion of infodemic is perhaps more understandable for people. And I think today what we see in information in humanitarian crises is just this often systematic undermining of trust in institutions and trying to convince and persuade audiences that humanitarian actors are actually not on the ground, not responding. And we've seen this in many crises, and many contributors to the book actually really wrote about the way that their organization has been impacted in their responses to humanitarian crises.
So then, Charlotte, who does that affect? I mean, the humanitarian workers are represented in a certain way, falsely or misleading, but who does that affect at the end of the day?
Primarily, it affects the people in need. So if you are affected by a crisis anywhere in the world, you want people to be able to respond. You want humanitarian organizations on the ground to respond to the needs. If you don't trust that the information, through the information that you're receiving, if you don't trust that that organization is actually doing what it says it's doing or is even present on the ground, then first and foremost, you're not getting the humanitarian response that you need in a crisis. And then the humanitarian organization, the volunteers, the staff themselves are affected because their reason being is actually to respond to crises is to be there for people in need. And if they're having to try to cut through noise and cut through campaigns that are really trying to undermine their credibility, then this will affect them. And so, in fact, it's affecting the whole of society. And that's why the report really looks at saying there needs to be also be a whole of society response.
Charlotte, great to have you on the program today.
Thank you very much.